We're going to start this week by picking up where we left off last week, and we're going to start talking about the non-vascular plants. And two major groups of non-vascular plants are liverworts and mosses. So a moss is a non-vascular plant that grows in areas of significant moisture. A bryophyte is another name for a moss that means moss-like plants. Rhizoids are the tiny hair-like structures that function like roots. And here's an example of rhizoids in this picture of a moss. Peat moss is a large branching swamp-dwelling moss that grows in very wet areas. Peat is the compressed accumulation of decaying plants, a lot of which is peat moss. Again, these plants also undergo the alternation of generations as I described last week in the discussion around ferns. Here are two examples of liverworts. A liverwort is a non-vascular leaf-like plant. Here's one liverwort here, and then this whole carpet of stuff here are liverworts. They also grow in moister places than mosses grow. Moisture is very important for the success of these plants. Moving on to algae, and I'm sure everybody who is listening to this has heard of algae before. Algae are classified by color, and so there are multiple different colors, and we will talk about them according to their classification, which is by color. The smallest of algae are the smallest organisms that actually contain chlorophyll. And they live primarily close to water or in water. They are extremely important environmentally because they are major producers of food, and they are frequently the first step or the bottom row of the food pyramid for a particular ecosystem. And so they are the producers at the bottom that perform the photosynthesis and bring energy into the environment, and then the subsequent consumers come along and eat the algae first, and then we have the various layers on the food pyramid. In the ocean, they're called plankton, and they're frequently eaten by small and large consumers. As a matter of fact, one of the main aspects of the diet of various whales is these plankton. The first of these is called green algae. Green algae is the largest group of algae, and it grows in colonies or clumps that are gathered together, and they have a filamentous hair-like structure that comes from the individual cells when they get together. Desmids are large groups of freshwater green algae, and here's an example of various kinds of green algae. Over here on this side is the volvox. This is a single volvox, and then here are a group bound together, and then you can have these filaments, which are also bound together. So volvox is an example of a colonial green algae. And this over here is called Spirogyra, which is an example of a filamentous green algae. Yellow algae are also called diatoms. Diatoms is one of the most abundant life forms on Earth, and the cell wall contains silica. And the reason this is important is because of something called diatomaceous earth. Diatomaceous earth is an aggregation or accumulation of these shells. After the diatoms die, their shells are left behind, and these dead diatom shells are then gathered together and actually harvested, and they're used to polish various things. They used to be put into, I don't know if they still are, but they used to be put into toothpaste so that they could be used to polish teeth. Brown algae is the next of these. Brown algae is what we think of as seaweed. And seaweeds are the largest in terms of individual plant size of all the algae. Kelp, for example, is a large group of brown algae that produces algin. Algin is a gummy substance that holds materials together. It's harvested and it's used to hold various foodstuffs together or give it substance. Rockweeds are algae or seaweed that is attached to rocks. And it's attached to rocks by a small organelle called a holdfast. And then those that grow in the Gulfs, like the Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America now, are called Gulf weeds. Red algae are famous for one thing. They produce a gelatinous substance that is used in food products. That gelatinous substance is also used to make agar. You've probably heard of agar plates. Agar plates are used to grow bacteria, and very important in the scientific study of microbiology. Also, red algae is harvested for its food value, and there are two forms, dulse and nori, that are edible and are actually served in some foreign countries. Dinoflagellates are microscopic one-cell algae that are found in fresh water. They are famous for one thing, the red tide. The red tide happens when the dinoflagellates bloom and they release a substance that kills fish. Now, this substance is not toxic to humans, but it is very toxic to fish. And when you see the red tide, you can see literally thousands of fish float to the surface of the water. Blue-green algae are small single-cell organisms, also known as cyanobacteria. The bluish appearance comes from another pigment which is mixed with chlorophyll and leads to the sort of bluish-green hue. One of these blue-green algae is called Anabaena. Anabaena is important because it fixes nitrogen in the environment. Nitrogen fixation from the atmosphere is the first step in the production of proteins. Eutrophication. So what's that big word eutrophication mean? It's the process in which plant nutrients enter an aquatic ecosystem. So it's the process in which the nutrients from a plant are part of an aquatic ecosystem. This can occur naturally, and it's generally very slow when that occurs, or it can occur rapidly through what's called cultural eutrophication. And that's when humans or human activity acts to bring the plant nutrients into an aquatic system. The next group I want to talk about are the fungi. Fungi are non-vascular plants that do not have chlorophyll. Now, without chlorophyll, you cannot undergo photosynthesis, and so that tells you that fungi have to eat. They cannot produce their own food. So they're heterotrophs. They have to get their food from outside sources. The thread-like structures that form the body of the fungus is called a hyphae, and then the mass of hyphae is known as a mycelium. People who study fungi are known as mycologists. And as I said, they have to get their food from somewhere else, and fungi are saprophytes, meaning they basically eat dead organisms, and they're one of the parts of the environment that's responsible for the removal of dead organisms from the environment. So there are club fungi. Some fungi can be classified by the shape of their spore-producing structures. So the club fungus has a club-shaped spore-producing structure. And here's an example of a club fungus. You've seen these out and about if you've gone out in the woods, or some may grow in your yard. These are mushrooms, also known as toadstools. Some people used to say mushrooms were edible and toadstools were not edible, but I don't think that distinction actually holds up. The stalk and the cap, so this whole part right here, the stalk and the cap is called the fruiting body. And on the fruiting body, on the underside here, are the gills. And the gills contain the basidia. Basidia are spore containers, and the spores fall out from inside here. And you can take a fungus, take this top cap off, put it on a piece of paper and tap it, and you can release the spores onto the piece of paper. Now this is another clump fungus called a shelf fungus, and the way it's attached to this tree, I think it's obvious where it gets its name, shelf fungus. Also known as a bracket fungus. These bracket fungi grow on the sides of trees, and you will see those if you go into the woods in Kentucky. Another club fungus is something called a rust. A rust is a parasitic club fungus that's called a rust because it's red in color. Now the interesting thing about this club fungus is that it's a heteroecious parasite. What does that mean? That means that it must have two hosts in order to complete its life cycle. And so here's an example of the two hosts for this rust. One host is wheat, and it produces a certain plant. And then the second host is the barberry, and it also produces, and this goes through these two hosts. And this is just the fact that when it's in its wheat stage is when it infects other plants. And this is how these types of parasites happen. This is not unlike what you see with something like ringworm or another of the intestinal worms that infect humans, because humans are only one of two different potential reservoirs. Ringworm, for example, grows inside an animal. The animal deposits it in the ground, and then the person is infected when they walk on that ground with bare feet. So these types of parasites need two different hosts in order to survive. Smuts are another type of club fungus which produces a mass of black spores. Now, another group is mold. Here's a white mold versus a black mold. There are bread molds, and then there are cheese molds. We generally don't eat the bread molds, but we do eat cheese molds. For example, if you eat blue cheese, it's undoubted that you're eating mold when you eat blue cheese. And then there are parasitic molds. There are also a group of fungi known as sac fungus, and they get that name because their spore-producing structure is a sac. Yeast, we've all heard of yeast because we put them in our bread dough to make it rise. These are small, colorless, single-cell organisms. A mildew is something that grows rapidly on wet clothes and in shower stalls. This is an example over here of mildew in a shower stall. Generally, they look black. And here's an example of sac fungus growing on the top of this plant leaf. Slime mold is a jelly-like organism that's found on the bark of fallen trees. Here's an example here of slime mold on these tree trunks. This is this is less dense. This is more dense than the same thing. And these is a close-up of the spore cases that are on the slime mold. The last thing I'll talk about in this short video is lichens. And lichens are a combination of a fungus and an alga. You have a fungus here and then an algal layer here. And these two live together in perfect harmony, also known as symbiosis. And symbiosis occurs when two living organisms live together and each benefits from living with the other.